Okay, hello everybody. So we'll be taking our third step from the Last Supper and lead to the cross. I'll start with an apology because, again, we left off with the end of Jesus before the priests, the Sanhedrin, whatever, where there are many explanations of that. And now we're going to be dealing with Jesus's trial before Pontius Pilate, and then try to understand many things connected to that. So here we have an interesting medieval depiction. Mark tells us this, and straightway in the morning, first thing in the morning, and it's interesting, all of the Gospels mention that. We'll try to understand why it's mentioned, even though it only makes sense to one of the Gospels. The chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. Matthew tells us, when the morning was come, and all the chief priests and elders, so of the people, so again, where is the whole council, but not that important, to counsel against Jesus and to put him to death. So according to Matthew, they decided to put him to death, but since they weren't able to, and when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So now Matthew lets us know who this Pilate guy is. Luke tells us this, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And John tells us a slightly different story. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. So now we know exactly where they took him, to the hall of judgment. Where that hall of judgment is, we will deal with in just a couple of minutes. And it was early. Again, once again, it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And that brings us back to the disagreement between John and the synoptic gospels, whether it already was Passover or they might eat the Passover, which was to be that evening. Now, when they tell us that they took him to the hall of judgment, that's a very problematic statement, because you can't just take somebody, knock on the court's door and say, hello, we have something to deal with. But according to John, and that's why it was first thing in the morning, they almost had an appointment because they wanted to finish this before the Passover. So Pilate was waiting for them. Now, how can we know that? At the beginning of chapter, John 18, verse 3, some of you might remember, then Judas have received a detachment of troops. In other words, there was the Romans, Pilate had sent some of his troops, 500 people, to partake in Jesus's arrest. Again, there's only told to us in John. And for that reason, since Pilate knew this was coming because he had sent the troops to help arrest Jesus, so that's why it makes sense that first thing in the morning, he was already waiting there to judge them. So now we're put into a perspective when we put all of the elements together. And we're going to start with a very strange thing. Now, the Nicene Creed of 325, which was the basic declaration of belief, and some 56 years later, the creed slightly changed, and it said this: I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Ghost, born to the Virgin Mary, and suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, buried. He descended into hell. That's where we're not going to get into the theological elements behind that. The church art about that is an amazing thing. But why in the world would the bishops, the church fathers, the church leaders decide to mention Pontius Pilate in the creed itself? Who else gets mentioned? Jesus is mentioned. The Lord is mentioned. The Holy Ghost is mentioned. The Virgin Mary. And then out of nowhere, Pontius Pilate. And we'll deal with that, why that suddenly came into being. Now, we also have to keep in mind, unlike issues that the church had to deal with in its early days, 381, we're already talking about the Byzantine Empire. We're talking about the Roman Empire becoming Christian. The Nicene is right at the very beginning. And this is already sometime after the church became part of the empire. So who was this Pilate? Let's get a few ideas about it. The name Pilatus might mean skilled with a javelin, because he came from, so that might have been a nickname. So it might have been because a javelin is a pilu in Greek, so maybe it was skilled with, or the second explanation that people sometimes give, it could also refer to a pileos, which is a type of a cap that a free man or a freed man would wear, the sign of freedom. So one of those two. We do know the name Pontius, which again, last name first in this case, means he came from the Ponti family, which was a well-known family. The most famous person, well, if he wouldn't have come to have been, would have been Pontius Aquila, who was the head of a tribunal. Julius Caesar had made fun of him, had conflicts with him, challenged his stating on the tribune, and then he partook in Julius Caesar's assassination. So we know the family is a well-known family. Now, the position that he received, the governor, or that is, or the prefect, which was the other term that would be used, was a medium level status. It wasn't even though we look at it today, commander of Jerusalem, commander of the whole center part of what is today Israel, it was an important position. It wasn't the Roman nobility that would receive that position. It's somebody who raised through the rank as an equestrian and then was awarded this position. So he was a medium ranked person. Now, interesting enough, Luke, and we'll understand this a little bit later, makes a point to twice mention Pilate long before Jesus' trial. The first one, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judah, and Herod being the tetrarch of the Galilee, and Philip his brother, the tetrarch of Iturea, and of the region of Trachdotis, etc. So he tells us, he puts us into the position that the area that had been controlled by King Herod was originally divided by his three sons. There was Archelaus, there was Philip, and there was, I forget his name, I'll remember it in a minute. And they controlled, they would divide up. The tetrarch of Jerusalem was unworthy, and then they put in a prefect to take his place. In Luke 13, he already tells us a bit about Pilate's behavior. And he says this: there were present at the season some that told him of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. In other words, he had killed many people. So we're getting an idea of what type of a person Pilate was, according to Luke. Now, we have very few external sources dealing with Pilate. We're going to go into a few of them now because I think it's very important, because once we understand who and what Pilate was, we can get a better idea of the trial and what went on there. This is an amazing painting by Rembrandt of Philo of Alexandria, who was a knowledgeable Jewish philosopher, who many of his writings and was used quite a bit by the church in its early days, lived more or less alongside Jesus, a little bit beyond him. And he wrote one of his writings, The Embassy of Gauss, he writes this: I can tell you something on which he prided himself, although I experienced countless sufferings during his lifetime. But you love and respect the truth. Pilate was an official who had been appointed, again, now we're using another term that can be used for his position, the procurator of Judea, with the intention of annoying the Jews rather than honoring Tiberius. He set up gilded shields in Herod's palace. In other words, we now know that Pilate moved into Herod's palace. That's where he would be living. There were two palaces there, a guest palace and Herod's palace. He moved into Herod's palace. They bore no figures and nothing else that was forbidden, but only the briefest possible inscription, which stated two things: the name of the dedicator and that of the person in whose honor the dedication was made. When Pilate, who was a man of, now we can get some ideas of his personality, inflexible, stubborn, and cruel disposition, obstinately refused and shouted, "Do not cause a revolt, do not cause a war, do not break the peace. Disrespect done to our laws brings no honor to the emperors." The Jews are challenging him. "Do not make Tiberius an excuse for insulting our nation," because he was officially the representative of Tiberius there. "He does not want any of our traditions done away with. If you say that he does, show us a decree or a letter or something of that sort." They're demanding from Pilate, if you're changing the status quo, if you're bringing in things that should not, we want to see that Tiberius authorized you to do that, because we know that he didn't, so that we may cease troubling you and appeal to our master, i.e., Tiberius, by means of an embassy. The last remark exasperated Pilate most of all, for he was afraid that if they really sent an embassy, they would bring accusations against the rest of his administration as well, specifying into the detail his venality, his violence, his thefts, his assault, his abusive behavior, and his frequent executions of untried prisoners. So the idea is that Pilate would have no problem executing prisoners or executing people, and his endless savage ferocity. So as he was a spiteful and angry person, he was in a serious dilemma, for he had neither the courage to remove what he had set up, nor the desire to do anything which would please his subjects. But at the same time, he was well aware of Tiberius's firmness on these matters. So Josephus, and this is also interesting, this is a 15th century depiction of Josephus from Europe. Josephus tells us this in his book, The Jewish Wars. The truth is, he gave a similar description in both of his books. "Now Pilate, who was sent as the procurator into Judea by Tiberius, sent by night those images of Caesar that were also called ensigns into Jerusalem. This excited a very great tumult among the Jews when it was day. For those that were near them were astonished at the sight of them, as indications that their law was trodden underfoot, for those laws do not permit any sort of image to be brought into the city." So Josephus tells us that what he brought in actually had images. Now, who is more correct? Josephus is a little bit later, but with that said, as almost everything he has said, except for his numbers, has been proven true when he's reporting it actually something that he saw. He was not present here, so we don't know which of the two are accurate. Nay, besides the indignation which the citizens had themselves at this procedure, a vast number of people came running out of the country. These came zealously to Pilate, to Caesarea. That's where Pilate came, that's where he sat, except when he had to come for special occasions to Jerusalem or elsewhere, and besought him to carry the ensigns out of Jerusalem and to preserve them, their ancient laws inviolable. But upon Pilate's denial of the request, they fell down prostrate unto the ground and continued immovable in that posture for 5 days and as many nights. The Jews actually were protesting and weren't willing to leave. On the next day, Pilate sat upon his tribunal, where in the open marketplace. So we know that in Caesarea, that's where Pilate would sit. Again, it would be different than Jerusalem because Caesarea was a Roman city that they had total control of who would enter and who would not enter, and called to him the multitude as desirous to give them an answer, and then gave a signal to his soldiers that they should all by agreement at once encompass the Jews with their weapons. So the band of soldiers stood round about the Jews in three ranks. The Jews were under the utmost consternation at the unexpected sight. Pilate also said to them that they should be cut into pieces unless they would admit of Caesar's images, and gave the intimation to the soldiers to draw their naked swords. So he said, "You don't agree, I'm going to kill you all." Hereupon the Jews, as it were, at one signal, fell down in mass numbers together and exposed their bare necks and cried out that they were sooner ready to be slain than that their law should be transgressed. Hereupon Pilate was greatly surprised, and at the end he removed the whatever he had brought into Jerusalem. So here we get an idea of Pilate's personality, fearing the Roman leadership, yet extremely brutal and not the person you would want. Now, something that happened later. After this, he raised another disturbance by expending that sacred treasure, which is called korban. In other words, he took money from the treasury in the temple, which name was korban, upon aqueducts, whereby he brought water from the distance of 400 furlongs. At this, the multitude had indignation, and when Pilate was come to Jerusalem, they came about his tribunal, again, the tribunal, we'll find out where that was, and made a clamor at it. But when he was apprised afterhand of this disturbance, he mixed his own soldiers and their armor with the multitude and ordered them to conceal themselves under the habits of private men, and did indeed to use their swords, but when their staves to beat those that made the clamor, he then gave the signal from his tribunal to do as he had bidden them. Now the Jews were so sadly beaten that many of them perished by the stripes they received, and many of them perished as trodden to death by themselves, by which means the multitudes were astonished at the calamity of those that were slain and held their peace. So again, there was a revolt for his taking money from the temple to build an aqueduct, and his response was he slaughtered many of them. Interestingly enough, if you look at Mark chapter 7, it says, "But ye say," and we had a whole talk about this some time ago, "if a man shall say to his father or mother, it is a korban," the same term that is used. In other words, it's money, a gift, something allocated aside for religious purposes. So Mark makes a point of using the term korban, similar to what was used by Josephus. This is actually the aqueduct that was built by Pilate. That's what most people will agree on that today. Till 1967, this was leading water into Jerusalem. Here we see a tunnel. You can see the pipes. The pipes that before this was just a ledge that the water would flow on. This was a tunnel that they dug through an actual hill to the north, to the south of Jerusalem, so you wouldn't have to, make the transporting of the water easier. These are pipelines. The thicker ones were laid down by the Ottoman Empire, or really but same place, same location where the water was actually brought in. Here you can see, these are at the Israel Museum, you can see pipelines to go over a valleyway. These were hooked together almost like Legos to form a tunnel to transport that water. These are the pools known as Solomon's Pools, located near Bethlehem, where the water would be concentrated. Again, keep in mind the original aqueduct was built by the Hasmoneans. 4 different aqueducts were built over various periods, but one of them was clearly built, and this is where the water this is already in the summer where there's very little water, the water that we're told about Pilate's aqueduct actually came from. How did Pilate's life end? And then we can go back to understand what he actually said. Josephus tells us this: "So they came thither armed, and thought the discourse of the man probable, and as they abode at a certain village, which was called Tirathaba, they got the rest together of them and desired to go up. the mountain in great multitudes together, but Pilate prevented them from going up. Now, the people we're talking about here are the Samaritans. There was a revolt of the Samaritans against Pilate, and for the reason, if we go down a little bit farther to where it says two, but when the tumult was appeased, the Samaritan Senate sent an embassy to Vitellius, a man that had been consul and who was now president of Syria, and accused Pilate of murder of those that were killed, for that they did not go to Tirathaba in order to revolt from the Romans, but to escape the violence of Pilate. So Vitellius sent Marsilius, a friend of his, to take care of the affairs of Judea, and ordered Pilate to go to Rome to answer before the emperor to the accusations of the Jews. In reality, it was accusations of the Samaritans, but we're not going to get into why he said the Jews. So Pilate, when he had tarried 10 years in Judea, from the year 27 to the year 37, made haste to Rome, and this in obedience to the orders of Vitellius, which had durst not contradict, but before he could get to Rome, Tiberius was dead. Now, the problem that many Christians over the years have had is from this moment on, Pilate disappeared. Now, if Pilate should have been for killing Jesus or for ordering Jesus's death, he should have received some punishment. That would be a logical thing on a theological level, but yet he didn't. And the question is, what happened? And Pilate disappeared from history. So there's been interesting response to that. This is Mount Gerizim in Samaria. This is where the Samaritans held, this is where the Samaritan temple was. There was a wonderful talk about that. This is on Mount Gerizim. This is on Mount Eval, which might be historical Mount Gerizim. You might remember the story of the 12 tribes of Israel coming out with Joshua coming into the land, 6 on one mountain, 6 on the other mountain, the curses and the blessings. And this is one of the most phenomenal things I think found anywhere in Israel, anytime, and nobody visits it except for these people in the picture. This is remnant of an altar from the time of Joshua and perfectly matches the biblical description of the altar built by Joshua. And thousands and thousands of bones were found there, all of them from animals the Jews would sacrifice, none of them from anything like pigs or what are called non-kosher animals. Here we have one of the ways that Pilate's end was dealt with, and this is a picture, 18th century if I'm not mistaken, of Pilate, or maybe 19th century, killing himself because he was unable to deal with the fact that he killed Jesus. This is one of the depictions of how it was dealt with. Here's another interesting way that it was dealt with, and this does not exactly look like the Middle East, because this is located in Fortingal, or the town of Fortingal. This is the tree that is said to be 5,000 years old. And it says, this is the actual marking of the place, which would have been some 3,000 years old when Pontius Pilate was born. What's the connection between the tree and Scotland? Well, there's been an ongoing theory which dates back 150 years, and if you visit Fortingal, from what I understand, I have not been there, they will tell you that this is the birthplace of Pontius Pilate. So if you have any Scottish friends, or if you're Scottish yourself, you can or cannot try to trace your roots back to Pilate. There is a tradition that he was actually born in Scotland. Remnants that have been found mentioning Pilate, this is the most important one. You can actually read Tiberium, and you can read Pilatus, and it actually says, we'll read the translation, to the divine Augustus, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, perfect of Judea, has dedicated this, and we're not sure what it is, because this was a stone that Pilate built in Caesarea and dedicated to Tiberius for something that he was connected to building. And this is the only major find that mentions Pilate from the time of Pilate anywhere. We'll see one other interesting thing that was found. This was found in Caesarea, and it was used as a bench in the theater in Caesarea as a secondary use. So they carved it down and decided to use it as a chair. This is the theater. It was found just about over here, whereas this is remnants of a Roman temple that was there. This, most likely, this was found some 60 years ago in Herodion, where Herod built himself his tomb, which had a beautiful resort that most likely Pilate actually used. And this is a ring that was probably Pilate's ring, because it actually says Pilate has his emblem on it. And this sat for 50 years not being researched because it was corroded, they couldn't see anything. And only when they started going through things, they actually discover that they found Pilate's ring. And here are coins that were minted by the time of Pilate. You can see Tiberius. This is Julius. These are coins that were made by Pilate, that's minted in Jerusalem, more or less in the time of Jesus. The years 30, 31, 32, 33 were the years that these coins were minted. This is the only external mention, finding of Pilate from the time of Jesus. Now, we talked a bit before, so Jesus was brought to Pilate. Where was he tried? John tells us this: then they led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they be defiled. We're not going to get into the problem. There really is absolutely no problem going in. They would be able to eat the Passover. And here we have a description which tells the traditional story. It goes like this.
Of the Via Dolorosa, which means the painful way of the cross. Here we are at station number 1 of the Via Dolorosa, and this is an absolutely fascinating place because this is the Antonia Fortress. This was the fortress that overlooked the Temple Mount that the Romans used for control purposes because the Jews would gather together on their festivity days and riots could break out. So when the Romans had occupation, they set up right here. Also, this was Pilate's palace right here, and this is the courtyard. This is the palace courtyard here, right by this Antonia Fortress. So this is where Christ appeared, and this is where he was condemned by Pilate before the raging Jews. So, well, we've climbed up a couple steps to show you that the Temple Mount is just right through those windows. So that's where the original temple was. So right here is the area of the Antonia Fortress, or the courtyard, or the Pilate's judgment hall. Wanted also to show you that the buildings here are not the original buildings. They have been torn down many years ago because that happened almost 2,000 years ago. These are new buildings, but we're in the exact place where Christ appeared to be crucified on the cross. So the floor area is considered to be pretty close to the original, but this upper area is just a newer building. So anyway, through those windows there is the Temple Mount, and that's where the original temple was. Well, we'll take a look here through the window, and we can see where the Temple Mount is. We can see where the Dome of the...
Okay, so here we had, no, it's a very important tape for multiple reasons. One, it's very important because that's why you understand why it is so important to have a tour guide, because many inaccurate things were said there. One, of course, Jesus was not crucified there. Two, that was not where Pilate's palace was under any circumstance, because the Antonia was a building built for Roman soldiers, built by King Herod the Great in honor of his friend Marcus Antony. Marcus Antony, in other words, the Marcus Antony from Cleopatra, not Marcus Antony the singer, but it was built in his honor and dedicated to the Romans, and that way they could have full control over what was happening in the temple exactly on festivals like Passover, etc. Would Pilate visit that location? Most likely. Was that where his court was? Today, I think any expert or any archaeologist or historian would agree that is not the place. So that causes a major problem.
Of the Via Dolorosa.
Now, so now let's see where the trial really took place.
Step from Jaffa Gate. You know, Jaffa Gate is the main gate to the old city of Jerusalem. Many people, tourists, come through this gate. Few meters from this step, you have this magnificent place. And in this place, apart is beauty, as the structure himself is very, very impressive. Inside, you can see all the sequence, the historical sequence and the archaeological sequence of ancient Jerusalem, from the time of the First Temple period till the time of the British Mandate. And I invite you to see this timeline, this travel in time.
The jail cells were neglected and abandoned until the Tower of David Museum stepped in. They hope to be able to use it as the site of their future rotating gallery.
And I hope that we meet again here 5 years from now, and we can say that the dream come true, and the Kishle will be our new gallery of rotating exhibition about Jerusalem.
The site, along with the moat, is opening to the public this week. And while it includes the foundation of Herod's Palace and Hashmonean Fortress, it also revealed dying pools from the Middle Ages run by Jews.
Amazing, because this is the moment which archaeology shake hands to the historical sources. And I remind you that in 1172, a Jewish traveler named Benjamin of Tudela came to Jerusalem of the Crusader period, and he mentioned that at the foot of the Crusader king's palace sat two Jewish and dying and painted clothes. This is the place.
So you can see where it is. It's right near, those of you who've been to Jerusalem, right near David's Tower was King Herod's palace. This is, as a matter of fact, a remnant of one of three monumental pillars, more or less, that he had built. This is much later, in honor of three people in the entrance to Jerusalem. This is where his palace was, and this is where the trial took place. And excavations now that took place there have actually discovered many of the halls that were there. Just an interesting little anecdote, that's where Jesus was arrested and probably held. And in the Ottoman period, it served as a prison. Under the British Mandate, it served as a prison. Under the Jordanians, it served as a prison. And under the Israelis, it served as a prison. Now it serves as a police station. Then it'll be evacuated soon because it's such a spectacular site that needs to be seen. So now we're talking about where it took place, but we're going to step away for just 1 second, because it's an issue that's worth dealing with, is the whole story of the Via Dolorosa, because we're not going to get the whole history of it. The Via Dolorosa is a Catholic concept. It's slowly being adopted by the Orthodox to an extent, and some people in the High Church of England. It's the Stations of the Cross, which you go to any Catholic church, you'll see it. It's the way of the suffering, it might be a way to translate that. And you have the 14 stations. It was a concept that was devised in Europe, not locally. Almost half of the stations are not biblical. And people would follow the Stations of the Cross to feel Jesus' suffering. The problem is the first, and then it was imposed into the geography of Jerusalem to try to make some sense, and then you have churches built all around there. The only problem is that if the first station of the cross is not where it's not at the Antonia, but rather at King Herod's palace, then we have a major issue. Now, just quickly, this 14 stations, Jesus condemned to death, not crucified, as that person said, at where he was tried. He's made to bear his cross. He walks up a hill and is weighed down by the cross. And just a side comment, we always see depictions of Jesus carrying a complete cross. People did not carry a complete cross. People carried one, they couldn't. It would weigh hundreds of pounds. They could carry the overbar that would then be placed on a pole that's already permanently in the ground. We'll see what that would look like soon. And that is what they would bear. So the Stations of the Cross are imposed, so he goes up a hill, and that's where he falls over for the first time, which of course, his falling over, his meeting his mother are not mentioned in the New Testament anywhere. Then he meets Simon, well, Quirinius is the way it's known in the New Testament, who was from Kyrene, where Libya is today, a Jewish pilgrim, and he was made to help carry the cross that is mentioned in the New Testament. Veronica, we're not going to get into that. It's an interesting story. Who Veronica might be, wipes his face. Tradition is Jesus's face stays in the napkin that she wipes his face with, and that becomes the first icon in Christianity. He falls the second time when he gets up to the top of the hill. The women of Jerusalem weep over Jesus. I wrote it in this way because usually it says that Jesus consoles the women, the young virgins of Jerusalem as it's defined. And there's a problem with that because his consolation is more or less Jerusalem will be destroyed and you're all going to die. I don't know if that's very consoling. He falls over the third time. He's stripped of his garments. He's nailed to the cross. He dies on the cross. He's taken down from the cross, and then he's placed in the sepulcher. There is an interesting movement in the Catholic Church today to add a 15th station, which is the resurrection. But that's just a side comment because, again, this isn't the biblical, this is a medieval, some will say it started in the 7th century tradition. This is the Via Dolorosa, just to get an idea. We'll put it in perspective. This is where the Temple Mount is today. You follow the road, you take a left. Damascus Gate is over here. You walk up, this whole road is known as the Via Dolorosa. This is a very interesting Polish church where Andrzej's Free Army, who came here during World War II, actually built the base. And then you head up to the Holy Sepulchre. This is Jerusalem of today. This is where King Herod's palace is. This is where Jesus was tried. This is where the Antonia is. And over here, more or less, is the Garden Tomb, which is the second place that people say Jesus might have been crucified and buried, where Calvary or Golgotha is located. This is the traditional location where it is. Here you can see the Temple Mount. So these are the stations of the cross leading into the Holy Sepulchre. This is most likely where it started in reality. Now, let's go back to the actual Gospels. Mark tells us, and Pilate asked him, what's the first thing Pilate asks him? Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answering said unto them, thou sayest it. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, art thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus he had answered nothing. So Pilate was marveled. Then story continued. Matthew tells us similar but different story. And when they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate the governor, and Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, thou say it. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said unto him, hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him, to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. So again, according to both Mark and Matthew, Pilate's first question was, are you the king of the Jews? He didn't give an answer. Then the priests accused him of many other things, and to neither of the accusations did he say anything, and Pilate was marveled by Jesus' reply. Luke tells a very, very different story. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Christ means the anointed one, kings were anointed. And Pilate asked him, saying, so here, in the first two cases, Pilate had earlier information of what Jesus was accused of, saying that he was king of the Jews, and he answered him and said, thou say it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and people, I find no fault in this man. And they were fierce, saying, he stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. So Pilate says, oh, Galilee? Look who I happen to have here. When Pilate heard Galilee, he asked whether the man was Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem. At the time, Herod was, of course, Herod Antipas, third, Antipas, Archelaus, and Philip. Those are the three that I forgot. So Herod Antipas was here. He said, you judge him. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was excitingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have some miracle done by him, which is an amazing story that comes out of nowhere, because we know from our same friend Luke, but then he questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. Herod saying, I can't try him, it's not my jurisdiction. But when then Herod's people, so this is a very, very different story, just an interesting little anecdote. Well, we'll see it in 1 minute. Let's cover John, then we'll see what happens, what Luke had told us before. This is a very interesting depiction from Rome. Here we have Pilate, here we have Jesus. This is the Ecce Homo, behold the man. And Pilate looks like a nice enough guy. Pilate then went to them and said, what accusations bring ye against this man? So John tells a different story also. He turns to the people, Caiaphas and the other. They answered and said unto him, if he were a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee. They then said Pilate unto him, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put somebody to death. That the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what his death should be. So here we're getting back to the story of John that we talked about in the last lecture, that John, almost everything was predestined in a way, that is, Pilate would now be able to fulfill what Jesus had spoke. But who do we blame for it? Then Pilate entered the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto them, art thou the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, saying, thou this thing of myself, or did others tell it thee of me? Now here we have a totally different Jesus. He's talking, he's answering, just like he did to Annas and Caiaphas. Pilate answered him, am I a Jew? Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? What would you do, Jesus? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. In my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should be delivered to the Jews? But none is my kingdom, not for hence. Pilate therefore said to him, so we're getting into a philosophical discussion, art thou the king? Then Jesus answered, thou sayest that I am the king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate said unto them, what is truth? So we have this Pilate that is depicted by, that we saw by Philo, depicted by Josephus as an evil person who kills people without trials, is getting into this interesting philosophical discussion with Jesus. And when he said this, he went out again unto the Jews and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. So now we have, well, we'll just cover a few other interesting sources from outside of the Gospels, and then we'll try to understand what we just read. 1 Timothy tells us this, in the presence of God, who gives life to all beings, and of Christ Jesus, who in his testimony before Pilate made the good confession. So Timothy, basing on John, says that Jesus confessed what needed to be said. And now let's just get some ideas of how Acts deals with Pilate and what Jesus said, and then let's try to dig in and understand what the whole story is about. For of the truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pilate and the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together. So now we know who is guilty in what happened to Jesus? Herod, Pontius Pilate, Gentiles, people of Israel. Everybody is guilty. That's the King James. In the NIRV, in fact, Herod and Pontius met with the Gentiles in the city, that they also met with the people of Israel, and of them made plans against your holy servant Jesus. So once again, people of Israel, Herod, which of course is very interesting because it's not mentioned in Luke, even though tradition is Luke wrote the book of Acts, and Pontius Pilate. The more accurate translation is for in the city, in fact, both Herod, Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples Israel. Now, it's laois, the peoples. Why? Because we have an ongoing conflict here between what John wants to let us see, that the ones guilty are the peoples of Israel, or as in the Passion Play, let his blood be on us, on all of us. So are all the people of Israel connected to this? Were there peoples, some people, or was it the whole Jewish people? Interesting enough, the later translate, both the NIRV and the King James, the New King James, if I'm not mistaken, corrected that. But there's an ongoing battle here. Once we see in Matthew and in John that he says, I see no blame in him. He did nothing wrong. You guys want to deal with it yourselves. Or did he actually sentence him? And it's very important for us to understand, and it's a touchy issue, because the question is, what extra elements and motives went into the different gospels writing the story? Because many of the things that are said here, there's no doubt that the people writing the gospels could not have known. If it was because except for John, it was in Pilate's court, nobody could hear what was going on there, so how do we have the testimony of what happened? What were the issues that, let's take Mark as an example. When Mark wrote his gospel, Christians or the Jesus movement were being severely persecuted by the Romans. So if he writes a book that is then seen as attacking the Romans, he's better off getting in trouble with the Jews than getting in trouble with the Romans. And for that reason, it's a possibility that the blame might be partially redirected, not to challenge the fact that he was taken to the high priest. And the high priest, as we can see in the story, was on very good relations with Pilate. Even to make it even more interesting, the same year that Caiaphas was removed from the high priesthood was the exact same year that Pilate was removed. They worked wonderfully together. They were interdependent in each other. Caiaphas wanted to keep everything quiet because if there'd be an uprising, if there'd be issues, he would lose his position and would also be damaging to the Jewish people as a whole and probably financially damaging to him. Pilate had Caiaphas keep things calm, and that way they could cooperate. With that said, the whole discussion is we have two totally different Pilates. We have the Pilate that Josephus and Philo wrote about. And again, keep in mind that they would have no ulterior motive to try to publish something that would challenge the Pilate the Christians were writing about. One, because when they wrote those books, the Gospels had not been spread, or in most cases, many of them written even. And two, Christianity or the Jesus movement played a very little part in the world at that time. It grew stronger much later. Now let's go back to the book of Acts. In Acts 13, we're told, for they dwell at Jerusalem, and their rulers, because they knew him not, nor yet the voice of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath. Luke is, they're challenging the Jews. They have fulfilled them in condemning him. So here we're saying what was wrong with those. And though they found no cause of death in him, yet desired they, Pilate, that he should be slain. So the order is put on the heads of Pilate. The Jewish leadership are put to blame a bit. And when they had fulfilled all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in the sepulcher. And again, once again, 1 Timothy that we had read before. So what was Jesus actually charged with? And what was he tried or found guilty of? Once again, first question asked in the Synoptic Gospels is, are you the king of the Jews? Now, we read afterwards that in Luke, the other Gospels tell it a little bit later, and Herod with his men of war, in this case only Herod did it, set him in naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. What is a gorgeous robe? We're told later on that it was a robe made of purple. Well, we'll deal with what the purple or scarlet was. Well, what could he have been charged with? In the time of Julius Caesar, there was a law that would justify putting people to death. The term applies to a number of criminal offenses against the state, including treason, sedition, desertion from the army, latter offenses against the emperor and his family. So, if he was accused of being king, in other words, challenging the leadership of Tiberius even more than Pilate, but challenging the Roman Empire, that was a crime punishable by death, and that's why he was asked about that. Now, Philo tells an amazing story that has nothing to do with Jesus and has everything to do with Jesus. And he tells us this: there was a certain madman called Carabbas, afflicted not with a wild, savage, and dangerous madness, for that comes on its fits without being expected, either by the patient or by the bystanders, but was an intermittent and a more gentle kind. The man spent all of this days and nights naked in the roads, minding neither cold nor heat, the sport of idle children, wanton youth. And they, driving the poor wretch as far as the public gymnasium and setting him up there on high that he might be seen by everybody, flattened out a leaf of papyrus and put it on his head instead of a diadem. We'll talk about what a diadem is. A diadem is a type of crown. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And clothed the rest of his body with a common doormat instead of a cloak, and instead of a scepter, they gave him a hand, in his hand, a small stick of native papyrus, which they found lying by the wayside, and gave it to him. When, like actors in theatrical spectacles, he had received an insignia of royal authority and had been dressed and adorned like a king, and young men bearing sticks on their shoulders stood on each side, and instead of spear bearers, in imitation of bodyguards of the king, etc., etc. In other words, the idea, one of the ways to humiliate somebody was to make him a king. Now, if Jesus was accused of claiming he was a king, according to John, well, in none of the Gospels did he deny that. And more so, the anointed one, who could be anointed, the high priest or the king. If Jesus was the anointed one, the Christ, then he was most likely claiming he was king. In Ezekiel 27 and many other places, 38 times in the Bible, we read, fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was that which thou spreadest forth to be thy sail. Blue and purple from the isles of El Shah was that which covered thee. So Jesus was dressed, as we're told, in purple or in scarlet. Scarlet was the royal color. He had a crown put on his head. We'll deal with that in a couple of minutes. So he was mocked for being a king. And if you remember, on top of his tomb, on top of the cross, it said, because there was a tradition, we're not going to have time to deal with that today, but in a number of sources, we see that the crime somebody was accused of or found guilty of was written, either hung around his neck or put on top of his cross. What was Jesus found guilty of? Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So in other words, challenging the authority was reason to be executed. Now, here we see again the purple clothing. This is a modern terrible this depiction of Mary, but in purple. Here we see two phenomenal things just found a year ago in Timnan, the southern parts of Israel. This is actual scarlet wool and woven scarlet wool that the nobility would wear in those days. Once again, you can see the depiction of nobility wearing either scarlet or purple of a type, which were the royal clothing. These are the actual actual shells from which both the scarlet and the purple were derived. And in some Phoenician areas, they found millions of these shells because they were the experts. Remember, those were also things used in the temple. Here's a very interesting depiction of Jesus in the purple clothing. This is from the 15th century. It was found in the depiction found in Bolivia, one of the earliest, one of the earliest remains anywhere that was brought over from Europe into the Americas. I think the second oldest, besides a cross that's in Cuba. And here is an amazing statue that even if you've been to Caesarea, you probably have never seen, a statue of a Roman ruler in purple marble. And again, purple royalty, spectacular statue, of course, lost his head. But again, Jesus is made, what Jesus is mocked for being is for being king. He was asked, what are you? And that is, to my opinion, beyond doubt, what he was found guilty of. And when he was found guilty, he was crucified. Now, let's understand a bit about crucifixion, and then we can actually get a better understanding of everything that went on in the trial. Crucifixion also establishes conclusively that Jesus was condemned as a violator of Roman, not Jewish law. Because if the Jews would have tried him, they could not have crucified him. A capital sentence under Jewish law would usually mean stoning. Matthew actually says that when Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee." In other words, the Jewish tradition, if you would kill somebody, it would be there were four ways executions could take place. In Judaism, we talked last week about how the Jews could not execute in those days, but the four types were given by court: stoning, burning, which wasn't really burning to the stake, but really somebody would be made to drink like burning sulfur, killing, which is with a sword, or strangulation. If Jesus was crucified, he was crucified and punished for something he did against Rome, not against the Jews, because the Romans could not have found him guilty. Even though I must say, most likely that I have my doubts whether Pilate would have really cared if there was a trial or not. Other aspects of the biblical accounts of execution that match common Roman practice, and these were things that let's see if we could, the flogging of Jesus, received at the hands of Roman soldiers before execution, his carrying the cross to the place of execution, guarding of the execution site by a unit of 4 Roman soldiers. So everything that went on with Jesus's crucifixion is line in line with the way people were executed in Rome. Here we can see the massive executions. And here's a few examples of what crucifixion was like in those days. The Roman general Varius lined the road from Sepphoris, we talked about that, to Galilee, in other words, to the Sea of Galilee, with 2,000 crucified Jewish rebels. We're told this by Josephus. Jewish uprisings and protests of the law led to the crucifixion of 2,000 Jewish insurgents, the selling of slavery of possibly 20,000. The most intense opposition to Rome came from an area of Palestine called Galilee, which was the center of the armed resistance movement called Zealots. So this is the revolt in 4 BC, which then led to the destruction of Sepphoris, which was rebuilt. We talked about that in a different lecture of Jesus' connection to Sepphoris. The procurator Tiberius Alexander, that's not the same Tiberius who was the emperor, crucified the sons of Judas the Galilean. And besides this, the sons of Judas the Galilean were slain. I mean, of that Judas who caused the people to revolt. This is an additional revolt that took place when Quirinius came to take account of the estates of the Jews, and we have shown in a foregoing book the names of the sons were James and Simon, whom Alexander commanded to be crucified. Then Titus crucified captives outside the walls of Jerusalem, which is very important to keep in mind, because when you crucify, you do it in the public place, because it has a very important meaning. We'll understand that in just 1 second. So they were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died. And when they crucified, and were then crucified before the wall of the city, this miserable procedure made Titus greatly to pity them, while they caught every day 500 Jews, nay, some days they caught more. And last but not least, in 6 CE, there was another revolt, and once again, the Jews were crucified there. So, but who would be crucified? Not every crucifixion was a special type of punishment for two totally different places on the spectrum. Now, there were lots of special cases. Two of the most common were the low-life criminals and the enemies of the state, and that perfectly coincides with the story of the thieves that were crucified next to Jesus. There were two very different matters. They are not the same thing. Low-life criminals would include, for example, slaves who escaped from their masters and committed a crime. And that's a message to all the slaves. If caught, a slave could be crucified. There were two reasons they were subjected to such torture, slow and humiliating death. They were receiving the ultimate punishment for the crime, and possibly more important, they were being used as a spectacle to warn other slaves who were thinking of escaping or committing crimes that what could happen to them. Enemies of the state had to be shown the power of the state, and crucifixion was how it was done. If you were a resistor to Roman military action, you were crucified. If you were caught attacking Roman troops, you were crucified. If you plotted to overthrow the local Roman government, you were crucified. Claiming to be king or thought to be king, or even more so, that's not denying that you were king, would be reason enough. Here you can see the plaques of what people were charged with. Now, well, I'm gonna bypass this. These are more interesting stories of crucifixion, but what we need to know, and just, this is a bit gory, I apologize, but it's interesting, and I think it's important to get a good idea of what actually went by. If somebody was crucified, and we'll see how we know this today, the 2 feet would not be crucified together. The hands would not be crucified. It would be beneath the hand. Either they would be given something to stand on or not. And somebody who is crucified will almost always die of asphyxiation. You die from not being able to breathe by not being able to expand your chest. Now, this is an unbelievable find, and this is how we know how feet were crucified. This was found in the French Hill area in Jerusalem, near the French Hill area, and this was found in a soiree, a little burial box of somebody who was crucified, but they could not remove the nail from the bone, so they just cut off the bone and then buried it with the nail. And until not long ago, this is the only actual remnants of a crucifixion that was found. This was found a few years ago in Rome of somebody else who was crucified. So these are remnants of actual crucifixions that took place. And now let's get to the crown of thorns, because we're told the crown of thorns was put on Jesus' head. The term crown of thorns, there are 2 terms for crowns in Greek. We dealt with one before. One is a stephanos, which is not exactly a crown, which is a term that's actually used throughout the New Testament. And then there's a diadema, which is an actual crown. So the crown of thorns was a crown, but not really a crown. Just side comment, there's a phenomenal mosaic found at the second station of the cross, depicting the crown that was put on Jesus. But despite that, using alabaster, you have light shining in to give a sign of hope. Philo well, we read this before, we're not going to repeat this. Now, this is the actual tree that the crown would be taken from. It would be, we'll get another look at it. You can see the thorns that come out of it. Here's the fruit of it. And it's known as the Sisyphus spina Christi. It is the, it's from the Sisyphus tree, and it's the wood that the crown was actually made of. So as part of the mockery that they were mocking Jesus, they put on the crown of thorns on him. Now so we'll try to conclude what we talked about today, because we're only able to touch, because due to limitation of time, we're only able to touch a certain number of the issues. We've even gone over the time, I can say. So Jesus was arrested by the Jews, who handed him over to Pilate. Pilate, the Jews, what did they say? He was blasphemous. If you noticed, not once did blasphemy come up in all the discussions between the Jewish leadership and Pilate, because Pilate couldn't care less about blasphemy. What Pilate wanted to deal with was to prevent somebody who was a troublemaker or somebody who called himself the king. And as such, he tried him. We saw the problem that Christianity had with how did Pilate not receive any punishment. And I'll give you two interesting ways that it was dealt with. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Pilate was seen, basing on what was written on John, as a messenger of God in a way. He was the good guy. The bad ones were the Jews. The good guy was Pilate, so much so that he is a saint in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In the Greek Orthodox Church, they didn't go that far, but they made his wife, who we didn't have time to talk with, made her a saint. So the dealings with how do you deal with Pilate, and how the early church had to lay the blame on the Jews for two reasons. One, to enable them to break from the Jewish world that the early members of the church were part of, and two, to not get in trouble with the Romans. And as such, that was the going line throughout the Christian theology throughout the years, until the last 100 years, where that has drastically changed. So to conclude what we've talked about in these last three lectures, Jesus went, we start off at the Last Supper, went to Gethsemane. Jesus wept and then was arrested, betrayed by Judas, handed over first to the high priest, who saw Jesus as a clear threat to their authority, and just turning over the tables in the temple were the final stake that was put in front of him, that he did, handed over to Pilate, who is perceived in the New Testament, to my opinion, as 1,000 times nicer guy than he actually was. He could not care less about executing anybody. And somebody who, at the eve of Passover, posed a threat to the order in Jerusalem, was more than enough reason to execute him and exhibit him so that everybody could know what to fear and to keep things quiet over Passover, because the last thing he wanted was to be removed, which happened a few years later. So I will end with this. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them.